Hello! Greetings. Welcome. Thanks for joining us again today. Thank you for giving us the gift of spending time as we seek to explore more of what God has made known in Jesus and through the Scripture. My name is Ethan. I work with the Venice Church of Christ. We're disciples making disciples in Los Angeles, and we want to be of service to you. We'd love to hear your thoughts about what we're talking about today. Please reach out to us in the comments or subscribe to us. And if we can be of any further service, please reach out to us at VeniceChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. When we talk about Abraham, a lot of people automatically kind of know something about Abraham, right? Even if you don't know a whole lot about faith or religion or Christianity, you know that Abraham was known as a really important figure in a lot of different religions and faiths. And so it's good for us to consider who Abraham was. What can we really know about Abraham based upon what has been revealed? And that'll be our consideration today. We learn about Abraham primarily from the book of Genesis, from about Genesis, the end of chapter 11, all the way through about Genesis chapter 25. And we could spend lesson after lesson talking about the various episodes in Abraham's life, and we're going to content ourselves today by looking at a much higher level and a few of the really powerful, important representative examples of the kinds of things Abraham was doing and the kind of relationship that he had. We first learn about Abraham in Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 27, that Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran died in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans, while his father Terah was still alive. And Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. And the name of Abraham's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, who was the father of both Milcah and Iscah. But Sarai was barren. She had no children. Terah took his son Abraham, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son's Abraham's wife, and with them he set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. When they came to Haran, they settled there. The lifetime of Terah was 205 years, and he died in Haran. So here we get the family tree of Abraham a little bit. Abraham will be named Abraham later. We're going to keep calling him Abraham just for consistency's sake. So Abraham, here we meet his wife Sarah. Sarai will be named Sarah later. And we see that she has no children. They're coming from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in Mesopotamia, very southeastern part of Iraq there, right by the Persian Gulf. And this is a very powerful time for Ur of the Chaldeans. We think Abraham lived somewhere toward the end of the second millennium BC, so somewhere between the 2100s, 2000s, a period of time before Jesus. And this is a very transitional time in the history of the entire ancient Near Eastern world. From our climate data, we're finding out that there was a very large persistent drought, a very big arid event called the 4.2 kiloyear event. We have evidence in Egypt, for instance, that beforehand, when the pyramids were being built, 500 years earlier than this, that there were grasses on the Sahara. It looked much more like the savannas, further south of what we see today. The drying out event that Abraham was living through, or happened just before Abraham, led it to be the kind of place it is today. And it wasn't just Egypt; it was also going to be impacting the Fertile Crescent. And whenever you have these kind of things, we see instability. So Abraham is living in this transitional time between what we call the early and middle Bronze Ages in the Fertile Crescent. And any kind of transitional time, you're going to see centralized power weakening, which is what you see, and we also see a lot of movement, a lot of people moving around, a lot of transitions. And there's a lot of question about Abraham and his historicity and things of that nature. We're not going to get into that, but want to notice that the story told about Abraham makes sense in the time period in which Abraham lived. It makes a lot less sense later. This is reflecting accurate memories of a time before Moses, before the late Bronze Age, let alone the Iron Age. And the world of Abraham would have seemed relatively different from the world that Moses would have known, and definitely the world that the Israelites in the later Iron Age would have known. It's also important to note that Terah, according to Joshua 24, was an idolater. They were serving the gods of Mesopotamia. They were not understanding or recognizing who God was. It is Abraham who we're told in Genesis 12 and verse 1 that Yahweh spoke to him, "Go out from your country, your relatives, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. Then I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great so that you will exemplify divine blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but the one who treats you lightly I must curse, so that all the families of the earth may receive blessing through you." And we're told in verse 4 that Abraham went. Abraham is also 75 years old. So we don't know a lot about the early years of Abraham. We know he goes from Ur to Haran, which is up on the northern crest of the Fertile Crescent, modern day Turkey, but very close to the Syrian border. And now he's being called to go down into Canaan. From the area that's very cosmopolitan, very urbane for the time, to an area that's a little bit less settled, to now an area that is even less settled. And Canaan at this time is full of the Canaanites, the Amorites. Time has not yet fully come. And Canaan at this time is under the dominion of Mesopotamia. Egypt is there, but Egypt is not really much of an influence or force. It is mostly Mesopotamia, as can be seen in chapter 14, which we're not going to probably discuss much today. So Abraham ends up in the land of Canaan. He ends up spending some time in Hebron. He ends up spending a lot more time in the southern area called the Negev. And he chooses the west part. He allows Lot to choose, and Lot chooses the eastern part, which was considered more fertile then, which is something that would have been true just before and during the solidification event of 4,200 years ago, but would not have been true by the time of Moses, let alone of the Iron Age. And so God promises that Abraham's going to get that land. He's going to get his descendants are going to inherit that land. We're going to now look at how in Genesis 15, God comes back and speaks to Abraham again and tells him that he's going to reward him in great abundance. So we can start seeing Abraham's frustration. How is this possible, he says, as my heir is Eliezer of Damascus? And when we think about Abraham, he is at this point something between 75 and 85 years old. His wife is 10 years younger. They're beyond the age people normally have children, and so these things almost might sound like a cruel joke. But God promises him, no, you are going to have a descendant who is from your own body. And he tells him many things that he can know about what will happen. Then in chapter 16, Sarah gives Abraham the Egyptian slave Hagar. And this seems weird to us, it seems strange, but this is a Mesopotamian custom. If a woman could not bear children, she would normally give a slave or servant to have children by proxy, and that's exactly what Sarah does here. And Abraham has a child, Ishmael, through Hagar. And Ishmael now will grow up as a son of Abraham. And then in chapter 17, Abraham is 19 years old, so that means Ishmael is about 13 years old, and Yahweh appears to him again and again makes a covenant with him that I'm going to make you very fruitful, you're going to be a father of many nations. Now he is called Abraham, and that his wife Sarah is going to be the one through whom he will have these children. And Abraham finds this, and just, I wish Ishmael lived before you, he said to God, because, he's already here, I'm already old, but God said, no, you're going to have a son through Sarah. And he laughs, because that's kind of funny, right? He's 99, his wife is 89. Those people have children. And so God says, I'm going to do this, though. And then he promises Abraham that this will happen, but that he needs to uphold the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. He needs to be circumcised, and so he circumcises himself at 99 and his son at 13, and all the men of his household are circumcised at this time because of God's commandment. Then, not long after, God will appear to him with two angels as men, and they will have a meal, and he will say that this time next year you will have a son, and through Sarah, and Sarah hears this and she laughs about all of that. Then we have the whole conversation about Sodom. We're not going to make much of it, except for the fact that Abraham feels confident enough in his relationship with God to haggle with God. Are you really going to destroy the wicked along the righteous? Along with the wicked? Will you spare the place for 50 righteous people? And he haggles down to 10 righteous people. And God says he would not destroy it if there were 10 righteous people. He destroys it. There weren't even 10 righteous people in the city. We're going to consider later the event that takes place in Genesis chapter 20 between Abimelech and Abraham. It's very important for our purposes, but we want to see that in chapter 21, God fulfills his promise, that his son Isaac is born to him from Sarah, even though Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90 years old. And this is a very important moment for the Apostle Paul. In Romans chapter 4, he will make much of this because Sarah's womb was as good as dead. It was dead, and God brought forth life from that which was dead. And that's also an important theme that will also take place in chapter 22, which is known as the Akedah, or the offering of Isaac, where God calls Abraham to offer Isaac his son as a burnt offering. And he proves willing to do that. He goes and he has got the knife over his hand when the angel stops him from doing that, and the promise is made. that because you've done this, I'm definitely going to bless you. All the nations of the earth will pronounce blessings on one another using the name of your descendants. That's going to be through his seed that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And after this, we see that Abraham starts making provisions. His wife Sarah dies when he's 137, and he is 127, and he is able to secure for himself the cave of Machpelah to bury his wife, the only piece of land he will own in the land he was promised. He does not want his son Isaac to marry a Canaanite. He wants him to marry in the family. He sends a servant, and his cousin Rebekah is brought forth, and Isaac will marry Rebekah. And then in chapter 25, we learn that Abraham takes another wife, Keturah, has a lot of children through her, and along with Ishmael and Ishmael's descendants, these are all going to be mostly your southern area people. The Arabian tribes are going to come out of Abraham from Ishmael and Keturah. And we're told that Abraham lives until he's 175, and he dies, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael bury him in the cave of Machpelah, with his wife Sarah. And that's the story we have of Abraham. Abraham is known as the father of the faith because everybody goes back and looks at Abraham because he was the one coming out of idolatry, and he's the one who trusts in God. He hears that voice of God, and he trusts, and he does. And it's because of Abraham that all the blessings can flow from that. And everything rest in the Bible comes from the promise given to Abraham. The Jewish people will take this and make very much of it in John chapter 8 and verse 33, after Jesus has said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They are very insulted. We've never been a slave of anyone. We are children of Abraham. Really showing the power and importance they put on Abraham. And for Paul, it's also very important. In Romans 4, not only does he make much of how you've got a God of resurrection involved, he goes back to in Genesis chapter 15, how God reckoned to Abraham his faith as righteousness. And he did that before circumcision, before the law, to show that that promise from the faith is not dependent upon the law. It's not dependent upon the circumcision, that God recognized Abraham's faith. And that is why Abraham was going to be the father of all who would come in the faith. He is the one who would lead to, of course, Isaac and Jacob. Jacob be Israel, so he's the father of the Israelites. As Christians, Paul wanted to make it very clear. You are children of God through what Jesus has done. And it's all through the promise God has made to Abraham, that through your seed, i.e. Jesus, he makes this in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 and 4, is the way that every nation of the earth is going to be blessed. So we're not supposed to see ourselves as standing before God independently of Abraham. The idea is that we need to be children of Abraham, but we're children of Abraham by faith, not from genealogical descent. And of course, Muhammad in the 7th century will make much of the idea that really the promised child is Ishmael, and suggest that Islam is also coming out of Abraham through Ishmael. And that is how all the three great monotheistic religions of the world right now all trace back to Abraham, that he is recognized as this embodiment of faith, this avatar of faith. And we need to recognize that, yes, that's the case, and we need to always remember that we only have our stand before God because Abraham listened and obeyed, and God worked his plan of redemption through Abraham, and we are now children of Abraham through promise. We should not see ourselves as disconnected from that, but we should never forget that Abraham has that because he was faithful. In fact, his faith is extremely deep and abiding to an almost scary level. I mean, you start really starting to tease out the implications of some of these stories of how he just hears this voice and starts following it, and how especially, go sacrifice your son Isaac. And that he proves willing to do that might seem a little crazy. And we don't have time to really dig into that, but what we should see is there is a deep and abiding, almost fanatical faith that Abraham has in God. And that is why he is the embodiment of the idea of faith and trust in God, that he never owned much land. Only place he owned was a cave he buried himself and his wife in. He trusted in God to uphold him and sustain him through everything. He did not have much confidence in the people around him. He maintained his distinctiveness from them. This is how he can be this great embodiment of faith. And we need to realize is what Paul tries to argue for us and explain to us in Romans and Galatians, that we are children of Abraham if we share in the same faith as Abraham did. That's how we are children of Abraham, and that we should look to Abraham as a model of faith and be willing to put our trust in God no matter what. Then we have the matter, though, of how Abraham worked with the people around him. And this is where it's very important and nuanced take that we have to have. Because Abraham doesn't have a lot of confidence in the Canaanites around him. He doesn't want to be as a Canaanite. It's very important that he does get a wife for Isaac away from the Canaanites. Because what would have happened if Isaac had married a Canaanite? Right from the get-go, the half of the inheritance of the people of God was going to be Canaanite. They were going to be pretty much wrapped right into the Canaanites. The fact that he keeps it in the family means that they are still Arameans. They're still from Padan Aram. They're from Mesopotamia originally. They're maintaining their distinctiveness. The Hebrews author makes much of this in Hebrews 11, that Abraham, and also by extension Isaac and Jacob, they don't own the land they're living in. They're putting their trust in God. They trust that God is going to give them a better inheritance, a better city. Abraham lives his entire life in the hope and promise that God is going to give the land that he's living on to those who will come after him, not the people who, not him in his own life, which is a pretty amazing thing. And to that, and we are also called to be sojourners. And that's the whole idea the Hebrews author has, that we need to be like them, recognizing we are sojourners because we are seeking a city that has foundations, whose author and builder is God. Our challenge is that we may actually think that we own the ground that we stand on, and that we may feel like we are home because we are in the land of our origin, and yet we're still supposed to have that sojourner mentality, that we're not supposed to be just like the people around us. But this gets us to Abraham's transgression, which we see very clearly in chapter 20, but was also in chapter 12 when he went down to Egypt, which was that he and his wife had the subterfuge, that since they shared a parent, that, well, Abraham would say that, have her say that she was his sister, so that they wouldn't kill him. And in fact, in Genesis 20 verse 11 even explains why. Because I said there is no fear of God in this land, and therefore they're going to try to kill me to take my wife for themselves. That's why I had her say she was my sister. And it's a subterfuge. It may not be entirely inaccurate, but it's not the entire truth. And in both of those stories, and it's interesting the Genesis author tells us both of those stories, in both of those stories, Abraham does not look good. He is considered a prophet of God, but Pharaoh and Abimelech in those stories seem comparatively more righteous. And we see that to show that what happens when you think that there's no fear of God, you start taking that into your own hands. Because after all, did not God make the promise that he was going to have children through Sarah? That means that he would still be alive to do that, right? So this is where Abraham lacked a little bit of faith in God, not because of God, but because of the way he looked at the people around him. And so we are supposed to also learn from that fault of Abraham to see, yes, absolutely, we need to be not exactly like the people around us. We need to maintain our distinctiveness, and yet we cannot act like there's no fear of God in the land, because if we don't prove trustworthy of the people around us, they may seem comparatively more righteous, and they may prove to be more trustworthy than we are in their dealings, and that would be shameful for us and shameful for God, and a reflection of God and his people. And so, yes, we're to be distinct like Abraham was, but we shouldn't presume and assume there's no fear of God in the land the way Abraham did, and to maintain our faith in God, maintain our confidence that God is going to watch over us, protect us, and deliver us if we put our trust in him. So we've looked at Abraham, hope that we can see why he is seen as this embodiment of faith. He is the father of all the faithful, and that if we are going to have our share in the inheritance in God forever, it is because we are children of Abraham by faith. And we certainly hope that you are, as we are as well. And we hope that if we can be of any assistance to you, let us know. May the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.